March 7, 1945. The Rhine River. Thousands of German soldiers rush across a massive bridge, retreating from the advancing Allied forces. Engineers stand ready with explosives to destroy it the moment the last man crosses. But something is wrong. The bridge begins to shudder. Steel groans against steel. Then, without warning, the entire central span collapses into the freezing water below, taking hundreds of soldiers with it. But this isn't the famous Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. This is a story that has been buried in classified documents for decades, a catastrophic failure that changed the course of the war in ways no one could have predicted. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. This channel brings you the untold stories of World War II that you won't find in textbooks. If you enjoy deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, you're in the right place. Now, let's uncover what really happened on that fateful day in March 1945. Chapter 1: The Strategic Nightmare. By early March 1945, Nazi Germany was a nation in its death throes. The Soviet Red Army was crushing through from the east, while American, British, and Canadian forces pressed relentlessly from the west. For the German High Command, every river, every bridge, every defensive position had become precious. But none were more critical than the bridges spanning the Rhine River, Germany's last natural barrier before the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. The Rhine represented more than just a geographical feature. It was a psychological barrier, a final line of defense that might buy precious weeks for Germany to negotiate some kind of armistice, however unlikely. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, had issued explicit orders: every bridge must be held until the last possible moment to allow retreating forces to escape encirclement, then destroyed to deny the Allies a crossing point. Among these critical spans was the Oberkassel Railway Bridge near Dusseldorf, a massive steel construction that had been completed in 1898. Unlike some of the more famous Rhine bridges, Oberkassel had been designed primarily for heavy rail traffic, with roadways added later. Its engineering was a marvel of late 19th century German precision, massive stone pylons supporting an intricate lattice of steel girders that stretched nearly 1,500 feet across the river. In March 1945, the bridge had become a lifeline for thousands of German soldiers retreating from the Rhineland. The 15th Panzergrenadier Division, battered and depleted from weeks of fighting, was falling back toward the east bank. Behind them came remnants of various Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units, old men and boys pressed into service in Germany's desperate final months. They were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, but they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that capture by advancing American forces meant the war was over for them. Wehrmacht engineers had spent weeks preparing the Oberkassel Bridge for demolition. Explosive charges had been carefully placed at key structural points, where steel met stone, where girders bore the greatest stress. The plan was textbook German military efficiency: allow the maximum number of troops to cross, detonate the charges at the last possible second, and deny the Americans a crossing point. The engineers, led by Major Karl Schaefer, a veteran of bridge demolitions across France and Belgium, had personally overseen every detail. What Major Schaefer didn't know, what no one could have known, was that the bridge was already fatally compromised. Years of heavy military traffic had taken their toll. The constant vibration of tanks, artillery pieces, and heavy trucks had slowly worked loose rivets and weakened welds. Allied bombing raids, while not scoring direct hits, had created nearby concussions that had subtly shifted the bridge's foundations. Most critically, wartime maintenance had been deferred again and again as resources grew scarce. Inspections that should have been routine had become cursory or skipped entirely. The bridge was like a man walking on a broken leg, still functional, but one wrong step away from catastrophic failure. And on March 7, 1945, that wrong step was about to happen. At 0600 hours, as dawn broke gray and cold over the Rhine, the first elements of the retreating German forces began crossing the Oberkassel Bridge in strength. They came in a steady stream, trucks loaded with wounded soldiers, horse-drawn wagons carrying what little equipment could be salvaged, and thousands of soldiers on foot, their boots creating a rhythmic thunder on the bridge's deck. By 0800 hours, the flow had become a flood. American artillery was getting closer, shells beginning to fall in the streets of western Dusseldorf. Panic was setting in. Officers tried to maintain order, but discipline was breaking down. Soldiers pushed forward, desperate to reach the eastern bank in relative safety. The bridge, designed to carry perhaps a few hundred people at a time, now groaned under the weight of thousands. Major Schaefer stood at his command post on the eastern end, watching through binoculars as the mass of humanity surged across his carefully prepared demolition site. He could feel the vibrations through his feet. The entire bridge was shaking like a tuning fork. Something felt wrong. The movement seemed different from the normal traffic he'd observed over the past weeks. There was a resonance to it, a frequency that made his engineer's instincts scream a warning. He grabbed a field telephone and called his deputy on the western bank. "Manfred, we need to slow the crossing. The bridge is moving too much." But the line crackled with static and urgent voices. American tanks had been spotted less than 2 kilometers away. There was no time to slow anything down. It was now or never. Get everyone across and blow the bridge. At 0842 hours, something gave way. It started as a barely perceptible sag in the center span, a slight dip that might have gone unnoticed amid the chaos. But within seconds, the sag became a lurch. Steel beams that had supported trains and tanks for nearly 50 years suddenly surrendered to physics and fatigue. The central section of the bridge dropped 6 feet in an instant, throwing hundreds of soldiers off their feet. Then the screaming started. The bridge was collapsing under its own army, minutes before the planned demolition, with the enemy still kilometers away. What happened next would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Chapter 2: The Collapse. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers had heard before, even in a war filled with explosions and destruction. It was a deep, grinding shriek of tortured metal, a sound that resonated in the chest and made the air itself seem to vibrate. Private Wilhelm Krauss, a 19-year-old from Bavaria, had just reached the midpoint of the bridge when the deck beneath his feet suddenly wasn't there anymore. "It felt like the earth itself had betrayed us," Krauss would later recall in a diary that survived the war. "One moment I was walking, the next I was falling through a nightmare of twisting steel and screaming men." The central span of the Oberkassel Bridge, a section nearly 300 feet long, collapsed in a cascading failure that took less than 10 seconds from start to finish. The steel lattice work, once rigid and precise, became a chaotic tangle of beams and girders falling toward the Rhine 60 feet below. Over 800 soldiers were on that central span when it gave way. They fell together, a mass of humanity suddenly subject to the simple, terrible law of gravity. Some managed to grab onto twisted steel as they fell, only to have their grip torn away by the force of the collapse. Others were crushed by falling beams before they even hit the water. The lucky ones, if they could be called that, fell clear and plunged into the Rhine. But the Rhine in March was a killer in its own right. Swollen with spring meltwater from the Alps, the current was fierce and the temperature barely above freezing. Soldiers weighted down with equipment and winter uniforms had no chance. Those who survived the fall and weren't knocked unconscious by the impact faced hypothermia within minutes. The heavy wool coats that had kept them warm on the march now became death traps, soaking up water and dragging men under. On the eastern bank, Major Schaefer watched in paralyzed horror as his worst nightmare unfolded. The collapse had happened so quickly that his mind struggled to process it. One moment there had been a bridge full of retreating soldiers. The next, there was a gap in the middle with twisted metal hanging into the river and the water churning with struggling men. His hand still held the detonator for the explosive charges that were now unnecessary, mixed into the rubble, or hanging from structures that no longer existed. Sergeant Hans Müller had been driving a supply truck near the rear of the column on the western approach when he felt the bridge shudder. Years of combat had given him instincts that saved his life. He slammed on the brakes and threw the truck into reverse, even before his conscious mind registered what was happening. The vehicles ahead of him weren't so fortunate. A Kübelwagen carrying 4 officers simply disappeared into the void, dropping into the river without even time for its occupants to scream. A horse-drawn wagon teetered on the edge of the collapse for a surreal moment, the terrified horses trying to back up, before the whole thing toppled sideways into the gap. The soldiers who had been following behind the vehicles now found themselves trapped on the western bank. Behind them, American forces were closing in. Ahead, the bridge was gone, replaced by a yawning gap that might as well have been 1,000 miles wide. The Rhine, swollen and fast, offered no hope of swimming across. They were cut off, with nowhere to go. Panic erupted. Some soldiers threw down their weapons and ran back toward the city, preferring to take their chances hiding in cellars than face capture. Others rushed to the riverbank, desperately scanning the water for survivors they might rescue. A few officers tried to maintain order, shouting commands that were largely ignored in the chaos. The careful military withdrawal had dissolved into a disaster. In the water, those who had survived the fall and the initial shock of the icy Rhine were now fighting for their lives. Private Krause had hit the water feet first, going deep enough to touch the river bottom before his natural buoyancy brought him gasping back to the surface. Around him, the water was full of thrashing men, debris, and a spreading slick of oil from ruptured vehicle fuel tanks. He grabbed onto a floating timber from the bridge and tried to kick toward the eastern shore, but the current was too strong. Corporal Ernst Zimmermann, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Stalingrad, found himself in the water next to a young Volkssturm soldier who couldn't have been more than 16. The boy was panicking, his eyes wide with terror, his movements becoming weaker as hypothermia set in. Zimmermann grabbed the boy's collar and tried to keep both their heads above water, but his own strength was fading fast. The cold was like knives in his muscles, making every movement an agony. On both banks, soldiers were organizing rescue efforts. Ropes were thrown into the water, human chains formed at the river's edge. But the Rhine was merciless. For every man pulled from the water, 3 more were swept downstream or disappeared beneath the surface. The screams for help grew weaker and less frequent as the terrible cold did its work. Within 20 minutes of the collapse, the number of visible survivors in the water had dropped to a handful. Major Schaefer, recovering from his initial shock, was now working frantically to save whoever could be saved. He had men forming rescue parties, others preparing hot drinks and dry clothes for the survivors, still others trying to account for who had made it across before the collapse. But even as he worked, part of his mind was already jumping ahead to the consequences. A disaster of this magnitude would not go unnoticed by the High Command. Someone would have to answer for this, explain how a bridge had collapsed before it could be demolished, cutting off hundreds of soldiers and potentially giving the Americans an easier crossing point elsewhere. The collapse had taken less than a minute. The rescue efforts would continue for hours. But the military and political ramifications would echo for weeks and months to come. As the sun climbed higher over the Rhine, burning off the morning mist, the true scale of the disaster was becoming apparent. Bodies were washing up on both banks. Equipment worth millions of Reichsmarks was scattered across the river bottom or hanging from twisted steel. And somewhere to the west, American forces were advancing toward a bridge that no longer existed. The Oberkassel catastrophe had begun, and it was far from over. Chapter 3: The Immediate Aftermath. By mid-morning on March 7, the scene at Oberkassel had transformed from a military retreat into a humanitarian nightmare. The collapsed bridge stood like a broken tooth over the Rhine, its jagged ends reaching toward each other across an unbridgeable gap. Bodies lined both riverbanks, covered with whatever cloth could be found. The count was still incomplete, but estimates were already climbing past 300 dead, with hundreds more missing and presumed drowned. Major Schaefer had set up a field headquarters in a riverside warehouse on the eastern bank. Around him, controlled chaos reigned as officers tried to compile casualty lists, organize continuing rescue efforts, and prepare defensive positions. The Americans would arrive at the western bank eventually, that was inevitable. Without the bridge, the German forces trapped on the western side would have to surrender. The question was how long they could hold out, and whether any could be evacuated by boat. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Hartmann arrived at 1030 hours, having been sent from Army Group B headquarters to assess the situation. Hartmann was a Prussian officer of the old school, ramrod straight, meticulously dressed even in the chaos of Germany's collapse, and carrying the authority of Field Marshal Model himself. His first words to Schaefer were ominous. "Major, you will explain to me how a bridge collapsed before it was demolished." Schaefer had been dreading this moment, but he stood his ground. "Herr Oberstleutnant, the bridge was under extraordinary strain. 800 or more men on a structure designed for much less. Years of deferred maintenance. Bombing vibrations. The metal fatigue was..." "Metal fatigue?" Hartmann's voice was ice. "Major, that bridge was supposed to be inspected weekly. Do you have those inspection reports?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Both men knew what the answer was. In the chaos of the retreat, inspections had been cursory at best, often simply signed off without actual examination. Resources were stretched too thin, priorities were elsewhere, and everyone assumed the bridge would hold long enough to be deliberately destroyed. While this conversation was taking place, a different drama was unfolding on the western bank. Captain Otto Brandt, commanding the trapped forces on the Dusseldorf side, was facing an impossible decision. American advance units had reached the outskirts of the city. His 500 men, a mix of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, and various support personnel, were exhausted, low on ammunition, and had no avenue of retreat. The Rhine mocked them with its presence, so close but utterly impassable. Brandt had sent runners to explore the riverfront, searching for boats, rafts, anything that could float. They found virtually nothing. The German military had already evacuated everything useful weeks ago. Civilian boats had either been confiscated or hidden by their owners. A few rowboats and a damaged barge were all that remained. Even if they could organize a crossing, they'd be sitting ducks for American artillery. At 1,145 hours, Brandt made his decision. He gathered his officers and gave them simple instructions: destroy all heavy weapons. Distribute the remaining ammunition to those who wish to continue fighting. For those who wish to surrender, there will be no shame. We are soldiers who have done our duty. The bridge's collapse was not our fault. Some officers protested. German soldiers did not surrender while they still had bullets. But most recognized the reality. They were cut off, outnumbered, and out of options. By early afternoon, the first American tanks rolled into western Dusseldorf. The 5th Armored Division, advancing ahead of the main force, approached cautiously, expecting resistance. What they found instead were white flags and exhausted German soldiers emerging from buildings with their hands up. Captain John Morrison, commanding the lead American company, was stunned when he first saw the collapsed bridge. "Jesus Christ," he muttered to his sergeant. "They blew their own bridge with their own men on it." But that wasn't what had happened, and the confusion would persist for days. Initial American intelligence reports stated that the Germans had prematurely detonated their demolition charges, killing hundreds of their own soldiers in a panic. This version of events would make it into preliminary after-action reports and even some early news accounts. The truth, that the bridge had simply collapsed from structural failure, seemed almost too mundane, too accidental for the dramatic scene before them. On the eastern bank, Major Schaefer was dealing with another crisis. The survivors pulled from the Rhine were in dire condition. Dozens were suffering from severe hypothermia, and the field medical stations were overwhelmed. Doctors and medics worked frantically, stripping wet uniforms from shivering men, wrapping them in blankets, forcing hot soup down their throats. But for some, the cold had done its work too thoroughly. Men would be pulled from the water alive, seemingly intact, only to die an hour later as their core temperature dropped too low to sustain life. Private Kraus was among the lucky ones. He'd been pulled from the water after clinging to his wooden beam for almost 30 minutes. Now he sat in a warehouse wrapped in blankets, his hands wrapped around a cup of ersatz coffee, watching as bodies were brought in and laid in rows. He recognized some faces, men he'd been joking with just hours before. The randomness of survival haunted him. Why had he lived while others died? What made him special? By evening, Lieutenant Colonel Hartmann had completed his preliminary assessment. He sat in Major Schaefer's commandeer office, writing his report by lamplight. The numbers were devastating: at least 371 confirmed dead, 289 missing and presumed dead, 147 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, and 503 soldiers captured on the western bank. Additionally, 12 vehicles, 8 artillery pieces, and substantial quantities of ammunition and supplies were lost. The Oberkassel disaster ranked among the worst non-combat losses of the war's final months. But beyond the numbers, Hartmann understood there was a deeper story here, one of a military machine that had stretched itself to breaking point, literally and figuratively. The bridge had collapsed not because of any single failure, but because of a cascade of small compromises and deferred decisions that had accumulated over years. It was, in its way, a metaphor for the entire German war effort in 1945. His report concluded with a recommendation that Major Schaefer be court-martialed for negligence. But both men knew that such a proceeding was unlikely in the chaos of Germany's collapse. The Wehrmacht had bigger problems than assigning blame for a bridge collapse. The war was lost, and everyone knew it. The Oberkassel disaster was just one more tragedy in a war that had become nothing but tragedies. As night fell over the Rhine, the rescue efforts finally ceased. No one had been pulled from the water alive in over 3 hours. The river had claimed its dead and would not give them back. On both banks, exhausted soldiers finally allowed themselves to rest, haunted by the screams and the sounds of rending metal that would echo in their memories for the rest of their lives. The bridge that collapsed under its own army had written its name in the annals of war's most bitter ironies. Chapter 4, The Investigation, 5,000 Characters. Within 72 hours of the Oberkassel collapse, 2 separate investigations were underway, one German, one American. Both sought answers, but for very different reasons. The German inquiry was primarily concerned with assigning blame and determining whether sabotage or incompetence had played a role. The American investigation, conversely, focused on structural analysis and intelligence gathering. Engineers from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers wanted to understand what had happened so they could assess the safety of other Rhine bridges they might capture intact. The German investigation was led by Colonel Werner Hoffmann, a military engineer who had designed bridges across occupied Europe earlier in the war. Hoffmann arrived at Oberkassel on March 10 with a small team and immediately began examining what remained of the structure. What he found troubled him deeply. The collapse had originated at the connection points between the central span and the supporting pylons, precisely where the greatest stress would accumulate under heavy load. Hoffmann's team worked methodically, measuring metal fatigue, examining broken welds, and reviewing the bridge's construction documents from 1898. What emerged was a picture of a structure that had been living on borrowed time. The original design specifications called for regular maintenance every 6 months, with major inspections annually. Records showed that this schedule had been followed religiously until 1941. After that, as Germany's resources became increasingly stretched, maintenance intervals lengthened. By 1944, the bridge was receiving only cursory inspections. More damming was evidence that concerns had been raised. A civilian engineer named Joseph Keller, employed by the Reich Transport Ministry, had inspected the bridge in September 1944 and filed a report recommending immediate repairs to several key structural elements. His report specifically noted concerning metal fatigue at pylons 2 and 3 and loosened rivets at multiple stress points. The report had been filed and apparently ignored, lost in the bureaucratic chaos of a collapsing regime. Major Schaefer, under house arrest pending the investigation's outcome, watched these developments with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The emerging evidence suggested that the bridge's failure was systemic rather than the result of any individual's negligence. But he also knew that in wartime, someone always had to take the blame. The question was whether it would be him or someone higher up the chain of command. Across the river, the American investigation was taking a different approach. Captain Douglas Mackenzie, a civil engineer from Pittsburgh before the war, led a team that included several structural specialists and a photographer. They couldn't access the eastern portions of the collapsed bridge. German forces still controlled that bank, but they could examine the western section and the river itself thoroughly. Mackenzie's initial findings were documented in a report dated March 15, 1945, The Oberkassel Bridge failure represents a catastrophic structural collapse resulting from multiple factors including material fatigue, overloading, and probable foundation instability. Of particular concern is evidence that similar conditions may exist on other Rhine bridges of comparable age and design. This observation had immediate strategic implications. The Americans were planning to cross the Rhine at multiple points. If bridges that looked intact were actually vulnerable to collapse, it could affect operational planning. Mackenzie's team was ordered to develop a rapid assessment protocol that could be applied to other bridges as they were captured. The protocol focused on visible indicators of structural distress, rust patterns, rivet condition, foundation cracks, and unusual wear patterns on load-bearing surfaces. The German investigation reached its conclusions first. On March 18, Colonel Hoffmann submitted his final report to Army Group B headquarters. His conclusions were stark and unsparing. The Oberkassel Bridge collapse was a preventable disaster resulting from systematic failure of maintenance protocols, bureaucratic inertia in addressing known concerns, and ultimately, the unrealistic burden placed on aging infrastructure by military necessity. While Major Schaefer bears some responsibility for failing to limit traffic on the bridge despite visible signs of distress, the primary failure lies with higher-level command decisions to defer necessary repairs and ignore warning signs. Hoffmann's report recommended that Schaefer receive a reprimand but not a court-martial. More significantly, it recommended immediate inspection of all Rhine bridges still under German control. This recommendation came too late to matter. By the time the report was filed, American forces had captured the famous Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, rendering most of the Rhine defensive line obsolete. The war was in its final weeks, and bureaucratic investigations into bridge collapses were rapidly becoming irrelevant. But the investigation did accomplish one thing: it uncovered Joseph Keller's September 1944 report. When this document was presented to Major Schaefer, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, certainly, here was proof that the bridge's condition had been known and documented. But also frustration and anger. How many lives could have been saved if someone had simply read this report and acted on it? Keller himself had not survived to see his warnings validated. He had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Dusseldorf in January 1945, dying in the same city whose bridge he had tried to save. His report, rediscovered in a filing cabinet by Hoffmann's team, became a quiet indictment of a system that had stopped listening to its own experts. The American investigation concluded in early April with a comprehensive technical report that would influence U.S. Army engineering doctrine for years to come. Mackenzie's team had not only analyzed the Oberkassel failure but had examined 6 other Rhine bridges that had either been captured or destroyed. They identified common failure modes and developed predictive models for assessing bridge integrity under combat conditions. One section of the American report focused on the human cost of the collapse. Based on interviews with German prisoners who had witnessed the disaster, American intelligence officers compiled a narrative of the event. This account, while not perfectly accurate in all details, captured the essential tragedy. The Oberkassel collapse represents a confluence of material failure, wartime stress, and the fog of retreat. The bridge did not fail because of enemy action or sabotage, but because of the accumulated weight of years, both literal and metaphorical. In this sense, it serves as a metaphor for the German war effort itself, a structure maintained beyond its capacity, stressed beyond its limits, finally collapsing under its own weight. For Major Schaefer, the investigation's end brought an anticlimactic resolution. On April 2, he was officially reprimanded and relieved of his command, but no further action was taken. By then, it hardly mattered. The Third Reich had less than 6 weeks to live. Schaefer would spend the remainder of the war in an administrative position, processing casualty reports. After the war, he would work as a civil engineer in the reconstruction of Germany's infrastructure, always insisting that bridges be maintained to the highest possible standards. He never spoke publicly about Oberkassel, but those who knew him understood that the collapse had marked him permanently. The two investigations, German and American, ultimately reached similar conclusions from different perspectives. The Oberkassel disaster was not the result of any single factor but rather a perfect storm of circumstances: aging infrastructure, deferred maintenance, bureaucratic dysfunction, wartime resource scarcity, and the simple bad luck of too many soldiers crossing at the wrong moment. It was a tragedy that could have been prevented at a dozen different decision points, but wasn't. And that, perhaps, was the most damning finding of all. Chapter 5, The Strategic Impact, 5,000 Characters. While the human tragedy of Oberkassel was being documented by investigators, the collapse was already having ripple effects on the broader military situation. The loss of the bridge, coming just days before the famous capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, forced both German and Allied commanders to recalculate their strategies for the Rhine crossing and the final battles of the European War. For the German High Command, Oberkassel represented more than just the loss of a crossing point. It symbolized the breakdown of the carefully planned retreat that was supposed to buy time for the defense of Germany's heartland. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, had counted on the Rhine bridges to serve two purposes: first, as escape routes for retreating forces, and second, as denial points that would force the Allies to conduct costly river assault operations. The collapse of Oberkassel before it could be deliberately demolished meant that German forces west of the Rhine were cut off earlier than planned. Captain Brandt's 500 soldiers, who had surrendered on March 7, were just the beginning. Throughout the Düsseldorf sector, German units found themselves trapped between the advancing Americans and a river they couldn't cross. Over the next 3 days, nearly 3,000 additional soldiers would be forced to surrender in the sector, soldiers who might have escaped if the bridge had held for just a few more hours. Model's staff produced a sobering analysis on March 12. The report estimated that the premature loss of Oberkassel had cost Germany approximately 1 division's worth of fighting power, not from the casualties of the collapse itself, but from the subsequent surrenders of troops cut off west of the Rhine. In the strategic situation of March 1945, this was a loss Germany could not afford. Every soldier, every tank, every artillery piece was desperately needed for the final defense. But the impact on German morale was perhaps even more significant than the tactical losses. News of the collapse spread quickly through the Wehrmacht, growing more distorted with each retelling. Some accounts claimed the bridge had been bombed. Others insisted it had been sabotaged by anti-Nazi resistance fighters. The truth, that it had simply fallen apart from age and overuse, was almost too depressing to contemplate. If Germany's bridges were collapsing on their own, what hope remained? For the Allied forces, particularly the American First Army, the Oberkassel collapse provided valuable intelligence and unexpected opportunities. The Americans had been preparing for a contested Rhine crossing, expecting every bridge to be demolished and every riverbank to be heavily defended. The collapse demonstrated that German defensive preparations were not as robust as feared. More importantly, it suggested that German forces were less organized and effective in their retreat than Allied intelligence had estimated. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, convened a strategy session on March 9 to discuss implications of the Oberkassel incident. The collapse had occurred in the British sector, but Bradley's forces were advancing on a broad front toward the Rhine further south. The question was whether to accelerate the advance in hopes of capturing additional bridges before they could be demolished. Bradley's intelligence chief, Brigadier General Edwin Siebert, argued that Oberkassel represented an opportunity. "The Germans are in chaos," he stated. "They're not executing their demolition plans with the precision we expected. If we push hard now, we might capture a bridge intact." This analysis would prove prescient. Just 2 days later, on March 7, the same day as the Oberkassel collapse, American forces would capture the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the first intact crossing of the Rhine and a military coup that would accelerate the war's end. The timing was not coincidental. The same factors that led to the Oberkassel collapse, exhaustion, confusion, breakdown of command and control, also contributed to the failure to demolish the Remagen Bridge. German bridge demolition teams were overwhelmed, communications were breaking down, and decision-making was paralyzed by the rapid pace of events. The Wehrmacht, stretched beyond its limits, was making fatal mistakes. From a broader historical perspective, the Oberkassel collapse marked a turning point in the Rhine campaign. Before Oberkassel, the Rhine was seen as a formidable obstacle that would delay the Allied advance by weeks. After Oberkassel and Remagen, it became clear that the Rhine line would not hold. German forces were too disorganized, infrastructure was too deteriorated, and Allied momentum was too powerful. The strategic analysis produced by Allied intelligence in late March 1945 explicitly referenced Oberkassel as evidence of German military collapse. One particularly insightful report noted, the Oberkassel bridge did not fail due to enemy action but due to systemic collapse of German military infrastructure. This suggests that similar failures can be expected across all domains of German military operations. The Wehrmacht is not merely retreating, it is disintegrating. This assessment influenced Allied planning for the final campaigns of the war. Rather than the cautious, methodical advance that had characterized much of the campaign through France and the Low Countries, Allied commanders now opted for rapid exploitation. Units were pushed forward aggressively, bypassing strongpoints, racing for key objectives before German forces could organize coherent defenses. This aggressive strategy would lead to the rapid encirclement of the Ruhr and the final collapse of organized German resistance in the West. The German military leadership understood what was happening. In a remarkable document dated March 20, 1945, Model's chief of staff wrote, "The loss of Oberkassel, followed by the capture of the Remagen Bridge, has rendered the Rhine defense line untenable. We lack the resources to contain multiple crossing points, and the evident deterioration of our infrastructure means we cannot reliably deny crossing points to the enemy. The strategic situation has become hopeless." This was not defeatism but realism. Model, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, recognized that the war in the West was lost. He would fight on for another 3 weeks before disbanding his surrounded army group and taking his own life rather than surrender. But Oberkassel had been one of the moments where he recognized the inevitable outcome. For the soldiers who had experienced the collapse firsthand, its strategic impact was both abstract and irrelevant. Private Krauss, recovering in a military hospital from his ordeal in the Rhine, cared little about strategy. He knew only that he had survived something terrible, that many of his comrades had not, and that the war was ending badly. The strategic analyses and command discussions that referenced the Oberkassel collapse were happening in a world far removed from his experience. Yet in the great machinery of the war, every piece mattered. The collapse of one bridge, a structure that most people had never heard of, had influenced command decisions, affected resource allocation, and shaped the final battles of the European war. It was a reminder that in modern warfare, the stability of a riveted steel connection could matter as much as the courage of soldiers or the skill of generals. The Rhine would be crossed at multiple points in the following weeks. American, British, and French forces would establish bridgeheads and drive deep into Germany. By the end of March, the Rhine barrier would be breached along its entire length. The war in Europe would end on May 8, 1945, just 2 months after the Oberkassel collapse. In the sweep of those dramatic final weeks, one bridge's collapse might seem like a minor footnote. But for those who experienced it, and for the commanders who had to adapt their plans around it, Oberkassel was anything but minor. It was a moment when the accumulated weight of years of war literally brought down a structure that had stood for nearly half a century. And in its fall, it helped bring down a regime that had claimed it would last 1,000 years. Chapter 6, Aftermath and Memory. The war ended on May 8, 1945. The Oberkassel Bridge remained a broken ruin across the Rhine, its twisted steel standing as a silent monument to the collapse of the Third Reich. In the immediate post-war chaos, there were far more pressing concerns than repairing a demolished bridge. Dusseldorf lay in ruins, its population struggling to survive amid rubble and occupation. The Rhine bridges, all of them destroyed either by collapse, deliberate demolition, or Allied bombing, would have to wait. For the survivors of the collapse, the end of the war brought different challenges. Private Wilhelm Krauss returned to Bavaria to find his hometown destroyed and his family scattered. He had survived Oberkassel, but the memory of that morning in March never left him. In interviews conducted decades later, he would describe recurring nightmares, the sensation of falling, the screams of drowning men, the impossible cold of the Rhine in spring. Corporal Ernst Zimmermann, the Stalingrad veteran who had tried to save the young Volkssturm soldier in the water, did make it home. But the boy he had tried to rescue did not. Zimmerman carried that failure with him for the rest of his life. He became a teacher in post-war West Germany, and colleagues would later recall that he was extraordinarily patient with struggling students, as if trying to save them in ways he hadn't been able to save that boy in the Rhine. Major Karl Schaefer, officially reprimanded but not court-martialed, found work in the reconstruction of Germany's infrastructure. He specialized in bridge inspection and maintenance, becoming almost obsessively thorough in his work. Former colleagues remembered that he would spend hours examining connection points and stress indicators that other engineers would dismiss as adequate. Karl acted like every bridge might collapse at any moment, one colleague recalled. We thought he was paranoid. Then we learned about Oberkassel, and we understood. The American engineer, Captain Douglas Mackenzie, returned to Pittsburgh and resumed his civilian career. But the Oberkassel investigation had changed his professional focus. He became a leading advocate for preventive infrastructure maintenance, arguing that the cost of regular upkeep was infinitely less than the cost of catastrophic failure. His 1947 paper Lessons from Wartime Bridge Failures became required reading in American engineering schools and explicitly referenced Oberkassel as a cautionary tale. The bridge itself remained a ruin until 1948, when reconstruction finally began. The decision was made not to rebuild the original structure but to construct an entirely new bridge using modern materials and techniques. The new Oberkassel Bridge opened in 1951, a sleek modern span that bore little resemblance to its predecessor. The old pylons were left standing for a time as construction supports, then finally demolished. By 1952, no physical trace of the original bridge remained. But the memory persisted, at least locally. In Dusseldorf, older residents remembered the collapse. Stories were passed down, some accurate, some embellished beyond recognition. By the 1960s, the event had become semi-mythical, with various accounts claiming different numbers of casualties, different causes of failure, even different dates. The historical record had become muddied by time and the chaos of war's end. In 1965, a local historian named Dr. Heinrich Müller attempted to compile a definitive account of the Oberkassel collapse. He interviewed survivors, examined military records, those that had survived, and reviewed engineering reports. His work, published as a chapter in a larger history of wartime Dusseldorf, finally established the basic facts. The collapse had occurred on March 7, 1945, had killed at least 371 soldiers with 289 missing, and had resulted from structural failure rather than enemy action or premature demolition. Dr. Muller's research also uncovered the story of Joseph Keller, the civilian engineer whose warnings had been ignored. Keller's widow was still alive in 1965, living in a small apartment in Dusseldorf. When Muller interviewed her, she pulled out a copy of her husband's September 1944 report, which she had kept all these years. Joseph knew that bridge was dangerous, she told Muller. He told me it would kill someone. He never imagined it would be hundreds. The publication of Muller's research sparked renewed interest in the Oberkassel collapse. A small memorial was erected in 1968 near the site of the bridge, bearing a simple inscription, "In memory of those who fell here, March 7, 1945. The memorial made no distinction between those killed in the collapse and those who died in the river or in the fighting around Dusseldorf. They were all victims of the war, and that was enough. For historians studying World War II, Oberkassel remained largely a footnote. The dramatic capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, which happened the same day, overshadowed the collapse. Remagen was a story of success, of American initiative and German failure. Oberkassel was simply a story of tragedy, and in a war filled with tragedies, it struggled to claim attention. But for those who study the war's final months, Oberkassel offers important insights. It illustrates how the German military machine was failing not just tactically and strategically, but literally, its infrastructure collapsing from years of deferred maintenance and wartime stress. It demonstrates how cascading failures in logistics, bureaucracy, and maintenance can have battlefield consequences as significant as any combat action. And it serves as a reminder that in war, the dramatic moments of battle are often less determinative than the mundane realities of maintenance, supply, and infrastructure. In the 1990s, after German reunification, there was renewed interest in documenting the war's final months. Oral history projects recorded interviews with surviving veterans, including several who had witnessed or survived the Oberkassel collapse. These interviews, now archived in German military museums and research institutions, provide vivid first-hand accounts of the disaster. They also reveal how differently individuals remembered the same event, proof of how trauma and time can shape memory. Private Krauss, interviewed in 1993 at age 67, was asked if he ever returned to Oberkassel. Once, he replied. In 1972, I drove to Dusseldorf with my wife. We walked to where the bridge had been. Of course, it was completely different, new bridge, new roads, everything rebuilt. But I stood there and I could still hear it. The sound of the steel breaking. The screams. My wife asked me what I was thinking about, and I couldn't tell her. How do you explain something like that to someone who wasn't there? Today, the Oberkassel Bridge is a busy modern crossing carrying thousands of vehicles daily. Few of those drivers know the history of the site, the bridge that preceded this one, or the soldiers who died there on a cold March morning in 1945. History has moved on, as it always does. The German Federal Archive maintains files on the incident, including casualty lists, engineering reports, and investigation documents. Researchers can access these materials, but few do. There are more dramatic stories to tell, more famous battles to chronicle. Yet for those who survived it, for the families of those who died, and for the engineers who learned its lessons, Oberkassel remains significant. It stands as a testament to how war grinds down not just armies and nations, but the very infrastructure of civilization. It reminds us that bridges can fail, systems can collapse, and that the accumulated weight of deferred decisions and ignored warnings will eventually come due. In a cemetery in Dusseldorf, there is a mass grave containing many of those who died in the Oberkassel collapse. The marker reads simply, "Victims of War, March 1945." They lie there still, soldiers who survived years of combat only to die in a collapse of their own side's infrastructure, killed not by enemy action but by the grinding entropy of a dying regime. Their story, like so many from the war's final chaotic months, is one of tragedy compounded by futility. They died not in a heroic last stand, not defending their homeland against invasion, but in an accident that never should have happened, crossing a bridge that should have been repaired or replaced years earlier. It was an ending that captured, in its way, the essence of Germany's collapse, sudden, violent, and utterly preventable. The bridge that collapsed under its own army minutes before battle has passed from living memory into history. The last survivors are gone now, their testimonies preserved only in archives and recordings. The physical evidence has been swept away, replaced by modern infrastructure. But the lessons remain, written in engineering textbooks, taught in military academies, and studied by historians. Infrastructure matters. Maintenance matters. Warning signs ignored will eventually demand attention in the most catastrophic ways possible. And somewhere in the archives, Joseph Keller's report from September 1944 still exists, a voice crying out from history, warning of a disaster that no one prevented, that killed hundreds, and that stands as a permanent reminder that the price of ignoring experts is measured in lives.